Hello, Alan. Thank you for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I recently read your book, Natural, and I want to understand why unexamined faith of nature's goodness can be so dangerous.
Unexamined beliefs of any kind, I think, can be problematic. And one of the things about the idea of nature and naturalness that I found when I was researching my book was that people really didn't understand how powerful their belief in natural goodness was, not just when it came to the foods they would choose, but also how they would raise their children, how they would regulate their own habits in their life, how they made political decisions or economic decisions. And when you have a concept that is so incredibly powerful, but people don't realize that it's powerful in their lives, that can be a problem for your own personal habits and your personal development, and also for discussing with other people what it is that you value and why you value it.
And what are some examples of something that's natural to us that could be inherently bad?
Well, let's take the idea that natural living in general, living in a natural manner is better. That's led in many cases to people valuing the idea of natural birth. But any anthropologist will tell you that access to modern medical care has drastically reduced infant and maternal mortality in the present day. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't value having a natural birth. I actually came to understand why people would value that in the course of my research and changed my mind about the ways in which natural birth could actually give a mother and a family an experience that was really incredible and important. But to think that because a natural birth is natural, it will also be safer, it will be free from any risks, that's not good. And it's actually led to unnecessary pain in many cases, and also injury and death. So that's a classic example of a place where believing in naturalness might hurt you. Another, very simple, is just wasting money. So natural foods often come at a premium. People will go to a store, you're trying to decide what to eat or what to buy, and you think to yourself, well, natural must be better. So I'm going to spend more money on organic foods, or I'm going to spend more money on foods that are labeled natural. And maybe if you're rich, it doesn't really matter. But if you're on a budget and you're trying to figure out how to allocate your funds, that kind of unexamined belief in natural goodness can cost you, literally and figuratively. So there's another example, not as dramatic as natural birth, where unexamined faith in natural goodness can end up harming you.
So eating organic is not necessarily better?
No, it's not necessarily better. And of course, there are going to be people who are listening to this right now who think to themselves, but I know all sorts of, what about pesticides? What about all these things? It doesn't mean that there's no value in eating certain foods that are produced organically. When I did my research, I talked to all kinds of people in the agriculture industry. And the more expertise I encountered, the more I found people would say something that actually threatens often the way in which we think about things. They would say to me, it depends. Some foods, it's really important that they're produced in an organic way or according to the organic regulations, because it is in fact better for the environment or better for workers or better for the humans that are consuming it. Not that quite as often, usually for the workers of the environment, but there were some foods where they would say, yeah, actually, organic farming has really been helpful. And then there'd be other foods where they say, no, it's not really helpful here at all, or it's not helpful for your health, but it is helpful for the environment. There was a lot of complexity there. And that's something, it's important not just to understand the decisions you make about food, but important to understand why binaries like natural and unnatural are so appealing. Because as humans, we only have a limited amount of cognitive capacity for making decisions. We know this when we experience decision paralysis. You go into a store, you're trying to figure out how to spend your time. You need an easy heuristic, a way of making decisions that reduces the amount of cognitive labor you make. And so natural, unnatural is very appealing, because all of a sudden we don't have to say, well, with this food, what's best? Or with that food, what's best? Now we know what's best for all foods, and we know what's best for all ways of living. That kind of easiness is very seductive. Simplicity is very seductive. Unfortunately, simplicity isn't always truthful or accurate.
So how do you shape your diet? I know you're also I would say, a critic of gluten-free. And you say,
well, I want to be careful there. I'm not a critic of gluten-free, despite the cover of my book. It covers the title of my book, which I didn't choose. Titles of books are chosen to be as confrontational and simplistic as possible. So even though my book is called The Gluten Lie, the first book that I wrote before I wrote Natural, it's not that I'm against gluten-free diets. For many people, gluten-free diets are quite literally a miraculous lifesaver. It's really true. There are people who have celiac disease. There's increasing consensus in the medical community that non-celiac gluten sensitivity does affect some people. What is not true is that all people ought to avoid gluten, or that because gluten is unnatural, which is something you'll hear a lot, that back in the day, people didn't consume a lot of gluten, so we're not evolved to eat gluten. That's not true. The lie about gluten is that everyone ought to avoid it, or that somehow human beings are not suited to consuming it. The other thing I'd want to point out about gluten-free diets, which I do in my book, is that the ritual of purifying your life, or the ritual of cleansing yourself, can be powerful not because of what's going on physiologically, but because it feels good to engage in a ritual that purifies you. It feels good to engage in a ritual that gives you control. So the other thing I want people to realize about gluten-free diets is that perhaps when they go gluten-free, it's not the absence of gluten. Perhaps, again, I'm only saying perhaps it's not the absence of gluten that's making them feel better. Perhaps it's finally feeling like they have control over what they're eating. Perhaps it's that they're no longer drinking 4 beers at night or waking up and having 3 croissants. Those things in themselves might make you feel better about your diet. But if you confuse the dietary demon of gluten with what's actually going on, then you never really understand your body and mind's relationship to the foods that you're consuming.
So this is very important because, as you say in your book, Natural, the myths that we tell ourselves ultimately shape who we are. So how have you managed to organize, or what myths do you tell yourself so that you have I know that we can't all be unbiased, or it's very hard to be unbiased, so that you have a more factual based reality rather than just believing in certain myths because they're brought to us by our culture?
What I try to do, and I fail as much as anyone else, is I try to be more comfortable with uncertainty. In one sense, myth is the opposite of certainty. Myth is the opposite of uncertainty. Myths are cosmic certainties. They are stories that reveal simple and unalterable truths about reality. And the opposite of a myth is uncertainty. It's being willing to say, I'm not sure what the ultimate structure of reality is. I'm not sure what the best diet is, best with a capital B. I'm not sure whether natural or unnatural is going to be right in this particular situation. And that can feel really scary to people. You'll often hear people often say to me, well, so do you not believe in right or wrong? Do you have no truths? Are you saying that nothing is true? Are you a cultural relativist? And that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that when I think about my life, I'll give you an example from a wonderful classic book by Carl Sagan, a science popularizer. He wrote this book called The Demon Haunted World. And in it, he said, if you read scientific studies, you notice that the data always comes with an error bar. What that error bar says is we're pretty sure, but we're also admitting that it's not set in stone. This is not a truth with a capital T. There is a possibility that this data is wrong or off. I love that, because what Sagan is saying is that we can live life knowing what's right or wrong, knowing what's true or false, accompanied by error bars. And those error bars say to us, it's okay if future evidence contradicts what I believe. it's okay for me to check back on what I believe and question it, to really question your fundamental beliefs. So the opposite of myth is the ability and willingness to live in uncertainty and to understand that uncertainty does not mean not believing in truth and falsehood. After all, science is one of the great sources of truth and falsehood, but science is also powered by, or ought to be powered by, humility. It is always questioning its most fundamental principles. Newtonian physics was the bedrock of physics until Einstein came along and showed that at very high speeds or at very high masses, Newtonian physics did not work. And for a scientist, that's not a tragedy. It's a triumph. And it does not mean that there are no truths in the physical world. It just means that we're always open to revising them. For me, really keeping that in my own mind and owning that is the way I try to avoid getting locked into simplistic binaries or myths that define my reality in a way that can never be shaken.
Well, and you just beautifully described open-mindedness. So do you do anything in the regular basis to stay open-minded? Do you look at both sides of the coin always, or what do you do?
Well, I'm becoming slowly an evangelical agnostic, which may sound like a contradiction, since agnostics are saying that they, sort of say they don't know about religious truths, but evangelism is telling people what the truth is. But there's a book I'm going to evangelize. It's a hard book to read, but it's the reason I ended up a professor of religious studies. And I read it when I was an undergraduate. It's called the Zhuangzi. It's got funny spellings because Chinese characters get phoneticized differently. It can also look like Chuang Tzu. This book was written 2,300 years ago. And what the book is, I think, is a kind of gymnasium for your soul. And when I say that, what I mean is, like you said, it tells you that one thing is true, but then it makes fun of the thing that it just told you was true. It sets up a character, the Zhuangzi, the author of the book, as a hero, and then it turns him into a fool. And then it turns him into a hero again. And it shows you how, as you change perspectives, the truths that you hold can change. And again, when I tell this to people, they say, well, does this book say that nothing is right or nothing is wrong? That's when I have to explain that, no, the book is not, it's not about what's right or wrong. It's a gymnasium. In the same way that I work out, I love the rowing machine. So I go and I row every day, basically. That's not because then when I'm in the real world, there's canoes everywhere, kayaks that I have to row. I'm training my body so that in the real world, not on the rowing machine, I'm fit and I'm ready to deal with what that world throws at me. The Zhuangzi is the same way. A lot of scholars and academics have tried to interpret it as giving you rules for life. It's saying, oh, the Zhuangzi is telling you to behave this way, behave that way. It's not doing that at all. What the Zhuangzi is doing is training your mind to be flexible, not because there is no truth or falsehood, but because when you are out in the real world trying to figure out what's true or false, that flexibility is helpful. So that's one way, that book and its centrality in my life is one way that I have of reminding myself that how easy it is to get locked into things. The other thing I do, which is pretty simple, is especially online, it's easy to interact with simple beliefs that reinforce your biases. Very easy to find a community of people who agree with you, who think that people who don't agree with you are stupid or wrong or bad, whatever it happens to be. So I try my best when I'm online to understand the strongest possible version of whatever the other side of what I believe at that time happens to be. What is the strongest version of this argument? So as an agnostic, I hate it when people wave away religious faith as something stupid or irrational. People are like, oh, faith is what faith is when you don't think about what's true, which is absurd. If you think about how many brilliant and wise people, many wiser and more brilliant people than I am, have had deep faith in revealed religious traditions, that means that if I'm thinking about religious belief and I want to engage with the strongest version of it, I can't just wave it away as irrational. That's absurd. It is very rational for people who hold it, and they have very clear and well-reasoned arguments for the position they hold. So I do my best to sit with those arguments for things that I don't believe, and sit with them generously, even if in the end I come away not believing them after I have done that interaction.
Well, that's an amazing practice. And I feel that with looking at the opposite side of the coin, understanding someone else's point of view that might be contrarian to yours, you really have to know how to handle your emotions, not get angry.
Yes.
So how do you do that?
Well, your listeners might be frustrated too, because another one of the things that emerges out of this agnosticism is I don't feel especially comfortable telling other people to do this, and I'll explain why. I've been lucky, and I said this I talked about this a bit when I was on Joe Rogan, but I've been lucky. I've lived a lucky life. I haven't experienced a lot of pain. My life has been relatively smooth, knock on wood, if that works. Other people have not had that kind of luck. Other people may be suffering. Other people may have been deeply wronged by society. They may have been deeply wronged by another individual in their life. And there are times in people's lives where, quote unquote, listening to the other side is not the right thing to do. There are times when the opposite is required, where they need to stop listening and get the hell out, where they need to tell someone strongly that that person is wrong, where they need to get angry, or even where they need to be sad. Which takes me back again to the Zhuangs of that book that I've been evangelizing. There's this line that I always used to puzzle over in it, where he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but happiness, sadness, anger, and calm, all of them are okay. Just don't let them get in and do you harm. And I always wonder, I was like, what does he mean? They're all okay. Doesn't sadness get in and do you harm? Doesn't anger, aren't those bad? Shouldn't you always try to get rid of those? But what I think that line maybe means, I don't know, he's always making fun of himself, so you never know, is that there are times when those emotions are required. It's okay to be super excited about something. It's okay to be very angry about something. Just don't let that consume you or destroy you. So make sure that you don't become an angry human or a sad human or a human that constantly needs to be happy. That will end up hurting you. So make room, even within that flexibility, make room for times when you are inflexible. Just don't become so stiff that you snap later. I think that's maybe one way to think about it.
Yeah, and all these emotions are part of the human experience. And a lot of people think that they always need to be happy, or they've been wronged, so they always need to be sad. So what you say is very important.
Yeah, the human experience is I find it funny, the idea that, and not funny, because who am I to talk about the great sages of the world? But often people imagine great sages as, they imagine enlightenment as being beyond emotions. Whereas I wonder if another version of enlightenment is being able to perceive all of those emotions as a part of what it is to be living a good life. It's an acceptance of those emotions, and some emotions are more difficult than others, and so I can understand why people would want to just rid themselves of those emotions entirely. But I don't know that that's the only way to do it. I think there's plenty of room for emotions in your life. I mean, otherwise, how are you going to have kids? How are you going to get married? How are you going to fall in love? How are you going to care about stuff? Those are great and wonderful things about being human, and those come along with being disappointed and being hurt. None of that. If the only way to achieve enlightenment or to live a good life is to eliminate that kind of variance from your life, something seems off to me.
And that's a principle of Buddhism. They don't tell you like, okay, you should try to get rid of this negative emotion, but instead they tell you to go deeply into that emotion and try to understand it and identify it.
Yeah, stepping outside of what it is that you believe and asking yourself why you believe it, or stepping outside of how you feel and asking yourself why you feel it is a terrific mindfulness practice from Buddhism. And I think it's very useful. And that's really what I wanted to do in Natural as a book. I want people to ask themselves, well, here's this word that really inspires powerful emotions. Can we step outside of ourselves for a moment and ask ourselves, well, what is it that we value about nature and naturalness? Why do we believe that it's better? Do we value the same thing when we say, I want a natural economy, that we do when we say, I want natural food? Or are they different things? What does it mean to want to go, as you know, from the book, to Yellowstone Park and to value its naturalness? Is that the same as the things we value when we say, look at the incredible natural talent that this person has when they're playing a particular sport? And my own perspective changed when I stepped outside of myself to examine my own opinions, and I found that actually that word natural means a lot of different things depending on the context. And if we were clearer about what it was that we valued, we actually might find that we could make a place for loving what's natural and for loving nature without also having to worship it, without turning it into a definition of what's good or what's holy in the world.
Yeah, because if we don't do that, then it's very easy for someone to say, okay, this is the natural way to run the economy, or this is the natural way to identify racists, or they could put natural in whatever their ideology is.
That's absolutely right. It's such a powerful word. It's like the word holy or the word God, except in a way it's even more powerful because it's disguised, since it looks like a non-religious. It looks like a secular word. It looks like it emerged out of science, nature, natural, evolution. We were evolved to do this. Is the equivalent of God commanded us to do this, but it's in disguise because it's using the vocabulary of science. And yet we'll find that we're easily manipulated when we're not aware of why that concept of naturalness means so much to us, and when it can be deployed by people who want certain things, whether it's the people who wanted to prevent interracial marriage, saying, well, this obviously isn't natural. If it were natural, well, all the races would be the same, but because they haven't interbred, that's why we have different races. So obviously it's not natural to reproduce with people of another race. And if you don't think too hard about that and you're a little bit racist, then that's a really great way to justify being opposed to interracial marriage. It feels very powerful. It's a very, very powerful argument until you step back a little and think about it and realize that actually natural doesn't necessarily mean good, that there are plenty of natural things that we try desperately to overcome, and that moral is not synonymous with natural. And I want to avoid making the kinds of mistakes that we have made because of an uncritical embrace of naturalness. I want to avoid those mistakes in the future while also creating room for people to love what's natural and to find meaning and value in the natural world.
And how can we identify people that are misusing natural just so that they could push an agenda?
Well, it's hard to know what's in people's hearts. Often what I think happens is, and this happens everywhere, not just with natural, You find, for example, that if people are liberal and Christian, lo and behold, Christ would probably be voting Democrat. And you find that if people are conservative and Christian, that Christ would have been voting Republican. And I think one way to look at how terms get abused is not that people are sitting around a table and saying, okay, I want to accomplish this. I'm going to use Christianity to dupe people, or I'm going to use the idea of naturalness to dupe people. I think instead what ends up happening is something seems good to somebody, or it seems right. And so then their mind immediately aligns it with the most important values in their life. So instead of looking for how people instead of looking for people who are abusing these powerful ideas to get what they want accomplished, I would suggest that people be suspicious whenever God or nature just happens to approve all of the things that you already believe in. That seems like a bit of a coincidence. And instead, to ask yourself, well, when it comes to nature and naturalness, why do I need that concept at all? This is separate again now from religion. I don't suggest to people who are religious that they should separate their idea of religion from their politics. Although I would say that if their politics always neatly lines up with their religion, that maybe they're turning their holy books into mirrors. And turning a holy book into a mirror isn't a great idea. You don't want yourself staring back when you look at God for advice. But with naturalness, it's a little bit different. I would want to say to people who are thinking about what's natural, hey, wait a second. Why does it have to be natural? Why is this term even a selling point at all? So whether the person who's using the term, and you'll see it everywhere, you see it in evolutionary psychology, you see it in books about how to improve your life, you see it everywhere. People say, well, this is natural, so it must be good. I just want people to stop and say, well, does that really make sense? Why is that good? You're wearing glasses, right? Why are you wearing glasses? The same reason I wear glasses, because we're looking at lots of little things on screens and in books. Is that natural? No, it's not. Does it mess up our eyes? Yeah, it does. Is that okay? Sure, we put glasses on. It's fine. Problem solved. I much prefer an unnatural world in which I look at little squiggly marks on paper and computer screens and correct my vision with glasses than a world in which we're not allowed to have written symbols. That's a more natural world if we define natural, which I think is reasonable as those things which were not created or altered by human beings. And it's a spectrum, and there's things that are more or less natural. They're more or less interfered by human beings. Surely writing is less natural than not writing, but that doesn't make it any better. I would never want to get rid of the written language, even if it messes my eyes up a little bit.
And do you think that this might be something that, well, first of all, I want to ask you, is this problem that you're seeing now with the word natural, is this something historical, or do you think you were looking at it more now?
I think it is. So one of the things that was really fascinating for me with my research is that these appeals to nature have occurred cross-culturally and trans-historically. They've occurred from the beginning of time and all different cultures. Some version of what was interfered with by humans is worse, and what was created by forces beyond humans is better. That idea, if you take that as a sort of proxy for natural, unnatural, that idea has been around forever. It's a very powerful idea, and I'll tell you why. Because look at the world. The world is an incredible, miraculous place. Forces beyond and before human beings, whether you want to call those strictly scientific forces or whether you want to call those religious forces, whatever those forces were, they made all kinds of incredible things. They made galaxies. They made dinosaurs. They made plants. They made bacteria. They made the whole earth. They made oceans and mountains. It's hard to imagine those forces being anything short of cosmically wise and brilliant. And then you look at human world, you see bad things happening, you see humans doing bad things. And it's very easy to think to yourself, well, the reason there are bad things happening must be because we have departed from that cosmic order that came before us. And if only we return to that cosmic order, if only we act naturally, then things will be better. So that idea has always been around. But that cosmic order has often been associated with religion. And so instead of saying we need to return to what natural things are, even though religion and natural have overlapped in many ways for the reasons that I just outlined, people were more comfortable turning to religion for advice on medicine, for advice on food, for knowledge of the climate. These were things that were all, universities were religious institutions, and to study the natural world was simply to study God. But nowadays, you will not go to a priest if you get sick. You will not go to your rabbi to find out what your most healthy diet is. You will not go to an imam to ask what the climate is going to be like. You go to a meteorologist and a nutritionist and or an expert on food if you don't trust nutritionists, which often happens these days, or whoever you go to. But you don't go to religious authorities, is my point. The sphere of religious authority is shrinking. But the human desire for simple explanations, cosmic explanations that tie everything together, that's still very strong. So what do you replace God with when you're looking for an explanation of how to live your life and care for your children and take care of the planet? a simple explanation, a simple set of rules, but you don't believe that religion provides those anymore because you know that you go to your doctor when you get sick. What do you do? Well, you look to nature. Nature is a wonderful secular substitute for God. And so I do think that that is going to become an increasingly powerful belief in a time when the sphere of religion's authority, the things over which religion has authority, is shrinking.
So nature or natural is like the new hip religion. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, what I would say, it's not that it's a religion. It's that nature becomes a substitute for God in the sense of a force that tells us how we ought to live. And natural becomes a synonym for holy. The reason it's not a religion, or the reason I'd be reluctant to say it's a religion, is that people who think that what's natural is good differ in enormous ways in the way that adherents of Christianity or Buddhism or Judaism or Islam or whatever, there's less unity about what's natural. You ask a vegetarian, they'll say it's natural to never eat meat. You ask someone who's on the paleo diet, they'll say it's very natural to eat meat. You ask a carnivore, they'll say the only natural thing to eat is meat. So the only thing unifying people who believe in naturalness in a certain way is that word, is that conception of what's holy. Everything else is sort of up for grabs. Some people, you got free market economists who will say that the natural market is one in which there are no regulations. And you got communists who will say that the only natural market is one in which everything is equally distributed because that's how it was in the past before currency was invented or something like that. So there's no unity. And in that sense, it's not really a religion, but the concepts are deeply religious, if that makes sense.
So that's how these people are so manipulated, I would say, because they have this concept that's holy and they have all these different avenues in which they try to fulfill that concept or try to get that connection.
Sure. And it's not just those people. It's you,
everyone.
It's you and me.
Yeah.
It's everybody. It's because in addition to that concept being so appealing, nature really is valuable in itself. Natural things really are. You find me a person in this world who doesn't find nature really valuable in some aspect of their life. Maybe they go fishing on a sailboat and they love it because there's no motor on the sailboat. Maybe they have plants in their house and those plants aren't plastic, or maybe they collect rocks, or maybe they like to go on hikes. I don't know what it is, but it's very difficult to find people who just see absolutely nothing whatsoever special in the natural world. They're not around because it really is incredible. And so I wouldn't want to say at all there's nothing of value in nature, naturalness. There is. It's incredibly wonderful and extraordinary in the same way that freedom is wonderful and extraordinary. The problem happens when you turn that valuable thing, take freedom as an example. Freedom's a wonderful thing, but sometimes we voluntarily restrict our freedom, like by getting married or having a child. And that doesn't mean that those things, it doesn't mean marriage is bad. And sometimes people will say, it's funny because when people like to do the same thing with freedom, they do with naturalness. They say, well, actually with my marriage, I feel freer than ever before. But that's nonsense. You're just less free in certain ways. And that's okay. With your kid, you're less free in certain ways, but there's other valuable things. And it's not a zero-sum game. The same thing with nature and naturalness. It's a wonderful thing, and it can, and it's worth preserving and protecting. But also sometimes what's unnatural is better, and sometimes you gotta, people are gonna like. Sometimes you gotta bulldoze that swamp to build the housing that's gonna help people who were otherwise living in worse conditions. Sometimes unnatural things are better. And that is gonna result in a kind of push-pull of what we value in specific situations.
Yeah, the only problem I see is that then people who want to do these things, I wouldn't want to call them unnatural, or create this bunch of houses and drain this swamp, they could then justify it and say it's the correct thing to do. Then where do you draw the line?
And it depends in every situation. So to those people who want to bulldoze that swamp, you want to ask them, well, what are the creatures in this swamp? How do the people in this area value the swamp? What kind of swamp is it? Do you really need these buildings? That's the kind of difficult and nuanced thinking that you have to do. And I didn't get to write about this in the book, but I was surprised to find that conservation efforts in some areas of Africa, for example, you would think that it would be locals who are trying to protect the environment and evil globalist developers coming in and trying to take it away from them. But in fact, that wasn't true at all. Often there would be locals who would want to, say, rent their land to a wind farm. This is one example that I encountered. There were some Maasai who had rights to land, and they wanted to rent it to a wind farm. And conservationists came in and said, you can't do that because of these birds that fly through here. You really need to preserve this natural landscape. But they actually just wanted money, understandably, from leasing this land. It was a very small area of the land. They didn't see any problem with it. And it was their land to begin with. It was not someone else's land to tell them what to do with. And I may have gotten the people wrong specifically. It's worth looking up online because it's an interesting story. Which again, are they wrong? Are they right? Whose right is it to the land? Should you allow people? It's a wind farm, right? Isn't that good energy? The point of that story being, it's complicated. It's a complicated issue, and the only way I think anyone could have a strong position on that particular issue is if they'd done a lot of research on it and talked to people who were involved with the projects and learned about the birds. And otherwise, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, you kind of remain uncertain. And it's okay. You don't have to have a strong opinion on whether a wind farm should be built in an area of Kenya. That's just not, to think that people could have an opinion on that, honestly, simply because they've decided that what's natural is good and unnatural is bad, is bizarre to me. I get it, but at the same time, let's be comfortable with humility and uncertainty. And when we have decisions that we need to make in our own lives, that's when we need to bring our resources to bear on a particular problem and make a decision, but always be open to change.
That's incredible, because yesterday I was asking one of my friends that studies nutrition in Cornell. So I asked her about gluten, about GMOs, about all these things, because I wanted to prepare. And she told me, well, it all depends, because you have to see on a case-to-case basis. So I think that's a great way to tackle all of these things that we're talking about. It depends, because it all depends on which case specifically you're talking about.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I want to emphasize this. It depends does not mean there is no truth. This is something that drives me nuts. I hear this all the time from people. It's not about things being relative. It's not about not having a strong opinion. It's about that error bar. And it's about understanding that truths are often local, not global. That questions, even that seem incredibly settled to us in a particular context, might not. I mean, I might not be settled. I mean, I remember, for a long time, I'll give you an example. For a long time, and actually this goes to the natural thing too. For a long time, I thought arranged marriages were just awful. They just sounded to me like the most oppressive institution I could imagine. And it didn't seem natural to me. It was arranged, right? It was arranged by, why couldn't you just spontaneously and naturally find the person you love instead of having it arranged by parents and social culture class, whatever? One of my good friends was Indian. And he was telling me that he was thinking about potentially having his parents arrange his marriage. I was like, I can't believe this. What? This is my friend. I go to college with this guy. What a crazy, why would he want to submit himself to this unnatural, giving up of his freedom? And the more I looked into arranged marriages, the more I realized that, yeah, there were ways in which they could be bad. Often women didn't have as much agency in those marriages as men. Often they reinforced the socioeconomic class in ways that were bad. But there were also plenty of things about arranged marriages that didn't seem so bad. And as my friend pointed out, when I was talking about socioeconomic class, well, what are the odds? I mean, not to put too fine a point on it here. So what are the odds that you're going to marry someone that never graduated from high school? I said, well, not very good. He said, well, in that sense, society's arranging the marriage for you already. And that interaction made me realize that perhaps my understanding of what a natural romance was just a justification of what I was used to, and that there might be more complexity to this institution than I had otherwise admitted to myself. So that's an example of something where I was very, very certain that it was a bad institution and that naturalness actually had a part in that belief. And I ended up having to question it. And if you ask me now, what do I think of arranged marriage? I'd tell you what, I'd say it depends. I don't know. It really depends. I'm not as certain as I was before, and that's okay. That's the truth. The truth is that it depends. That's not relative. That's a truth claim that I'm making. So you can think also of uncertainty not as refusing the truth, but as embracing a truth that's more complicated than people would want to believe.
It could be the ultimate truth, I would say. In a certain, we evangelical agnostics are very uncomfortable with ultimate things, but it is a way of thinking about our relationship to cosmic truths that to me seems very fulfilling. Again, to invoke science, there are plenty of questions about which scientists are happy to say, well, we don't know, or we're not sure. That doesn't mean, again, another example, and I think I'm not an ornithologist, so I'm not super up to date on this, but I don't think, and this is really incredible to me, I don't think scientists still don't know how all birds are able to do their migrations, these enormous global migrations. They just don't know exactly what the mechanism is that birds use to do this. So if you ask them, how do birds do it? And they say, well, we don't know. That doesn't mean they're relativists. That doesn't mean that there isn't any truth about it. It means that the truth is they don't know. It's something they haven't thought of yet. That's not relativism. That's honesty. And I think that conceptualizing this, whatever you don't know, saying that you don't know, and tackling things instead of looking for ultimate truths, as we love to do, as we've talked about, take things in a case-by-case basis and understand a specific circumstance in a more micro level. Then in that sense, I feel that you could have a more set point of view, but still having that little room of possibility of being wrong.
Yep. Refusing to change can take up as much energy as being willing to change.
Beautiful, Alan. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Very eye-opening. Is there anything else that you'd like to say or anything you'd like to promote?
I mean, for someone who's advocating that unnatural things are good, I love social media. I'm on Twitter all the time. So I'd encourage people to follow me at Alan Levinovitz and check out my books, Google around. I've written a bunch of stuff. I've changed my mind, of course. So things I've written in the past, I would probably have a different perspective on now. But I do encourage people, if they found this helpful and interesting, to seek me out on Twitter and to check out some of the things I've written.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Rebound Talks podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. We're coming out with episodes every single Wednesday, so please subscribe, leave a like, and if you found anything useful, comment it down below. See you next week.